Aloha, ahi ahi, kako, apo, nab. Nui ka uhaloli, no ki halavai. I'm very happy that we're meeting and to have a chance to talk about the king who for a long time had been kind of not ignored but neglected to a certain extent, namely Kala. Very interesting name. Already the name shows that there was some trouble because Kala Kaua means the day of battle. Why? Because when he was born, November 16th, 1836, the British had imposed an unequal treaty on the Kingdom of Hawaii, which did not sit very well with the Lahui. Therefore, he got this name. When we talk about his birth, we have two interesting paintings here, which were presented to the king on his 50th birthday. So in 1886, the one to the left shows Honolulu when he was born. You see in front a va'a, a canoe, with a missionary in a top hat. Kalavina, Calvinist missionary. Perhaps you know when they arrived, the first company, when did the first company of Kalavina arrive from Enelani, New England? 1820, and Hawaii would never be the same ever since they set their feet upon the soil. But we're not going to talk about that so much right now. We're talking about Pinkala'akoa. So that's the view. In 1836, you see the famous fort with the Hawaiian flag. Very small town. Honolulu really was originally a fishing village by the name of Ko. And at this time, perhaps 3,000 Hawaiians, a few missionaries, and a number of sea captains and businessmen from all over the place, mostly from Beretania, Britain, and also America Huipuia, the United States. Pretty soon some Germans will arrive, and the biggest of the big five eventually will be a German company. Most people don't realize this. What was the name of that? Ark Federal Company. And very sad story because it was expropriated in the wake of World War I by the same people who had overthrown the Queen, by the way. So the Germans shared the same fate in this matter. But much happier, on his 50th birthday, look what we have here, a modern, booming town with electric lights, with streetcars pulled by mules. Pretty soon they will be electrified. You even see a dry dock, and that shows how advanced Honolulu was. You see there on the right? That plays a role, by the way. In '69, when an Austrian warship limped into port, it had suffered damage of its rudder in typhoon near China, and the only place where it could be repaired was here. And what do we owe to that ship? The ship's name was Donau, or Daniel, Austria-Hungary. We have an organization which regales all of us, particularly on Fridays and special days, musically, the Royal Hawaiian Band. Without that ship, we would not have it anymore, most likely. Anyway, modern city, maybe 7,000 people or so, hotels, luxury hotel, which had been built just a few years before Kaua's birthday, the first Royal Hawaiian hotel with all the amenities you can possibly imagine. Where was it?
Downtown.
Yes, where today is the Museum of Modern Art. So the original Royal Hawaiian Hotel was there. It was built by the first dentist here, who also had a cabinet position, and by King Kamehameha V. Kamehameha V, he supported that. And the reason was some Australian tourists had complained that Honolulu was a great place, but the accommodations were not quite up to par, and they wanted something really grand, and so they built this. Today it would be a 5-star hotel, the Royal Hawaiian, the original Royal Hawaiian Hotel. So, electric lights even before the White House. So Hawaii was really at the cutting edge. Also, railroad system. What are we doing now with this rail? We had it all. So what happened? Anyway, these two paintings really show what happened in the life of Kalakaua. And by the way, this birthday celebration, which lasted for 2 weeks, we reenacted back in 1986. I happened to be the chair of the Special Events Committee, so we reenacted everything, including the Royal Ball, and it was a huge success. Torchlight parade, you name it. A regatta, you have one of the famous clubs, rowing clubs, you see, right in front there. So, this really tells an interesting story. So, Kalakaua. When David La'amea Kamana Kapu'u Manaia o Kalani Nahinolani, Kalakaua was born. As I said, there were about 2,000 Hawaiians here, a handful of missionaries, and some 100 haole, who were sea captains and businessmen. By the way, we have an interesting diary by a gentleman by the name of Reynolds, who already in his diary shows what it was like in the 1820s in Honolulu, which was not yet the capital. When did Honolulu become the capital of the island? 1850. Why? Where was the capital before? Lahaina, because of the whalers, and before that, at one time it was here, the compound of Kamehameha, just across from what today is Aloha Tower, but mostly it was on the island of Hawaii. So, he presided over a flourishing country. It was really the leader of the entire Pacific. Everybody in the Pacific looked up to Hawaii. It had managed to be accepted into the most exclusive club, namely the Family of Nations. Independence. It was the first non-Western independent state in the world, not only in Asia Pacific, but in the entire world. When was Hawaii lifted into this very select group? When?
1843.
On which day?
It was.
What do we call this? Kalakaua, Independence Day, and we're celebrating it again. How did that happen? That's before Kalakaua, of course. How did that happen?
Because Hawaii was part of England, maybe.
Well, I always wonder about that. I think they had a kind of alliance with England. And it was really only the island of Hawaii which had this alliance, because when Kamehameha got together with Captain Vancouver, you're referring to that, he controlled only the island of Hawaii, and the rest he didn't, just yet. So I think it was more an alliance between the two, and but however you interpret it, the case was that Hawaii was always close to Britain. You can see this here, Union Jack, which is a combination of which flags?
Scotland
and
England.
Yeah, right, Scotland and England. The Union flag or the Union Jack. And then, ingenious, these stripes. So, This, of course, is due to Kamehameha and a sea captain. It's an ingenious flag because when it was designed in 1816 and there was a threat of a takeover by some colonial power, a French captain would say, wait a minute, they have the colours of my flag. How is that? British captain would say, yeah, Union Jack. An American captain would say, what? They have stripes, somewhat the way we have it. A Russian captain, same colours, and the Dutch captain also. So it covered all these bases, if you will. And someone, I don't know how true that is, says that it's also representation of the four major gods of the classical religion of Hawaii. Which gods? Ku,
Kane, Lono,
Kanaloa, and Lono. If that's true, then it's even more ingenious, but they cannot quite prove that. Anyway, Hawaiian flag, ingenious. So, Hawaii was the leader in the Pacific, everybody looked up to it. Tonga and Samoa and so forth. Tonga, by the way, the Kingdom of Tonga, you know what kind of constitution they have today in 2018? Constitution of Hawaii of 1864, with some modifications. Samoa had that constitution for a few years, and so did Fiji, the Kingdom of Thakumba. So you can see how progressive Hawaii was. And then it was a center of music. Royal Hawaiian Band, we already mentioned. Now we can talk about Na Lani Eha. Who were those persons? Na Lani Eha. There's a street by that name, by the way. Na Lani Eha. Hawaii Killer. The Queen. Who else? Kalakaua, Lele Iohoku. Yeah, all four of them. So, wonderful music, Aloha Hawaii, the most famous. The Royal Hawaiian Band would play waltzes, polkas, mazurkas, operettas, and then famous Hawaiian songs like Akahioi or Sanoe. If you know the history of Sanoe, that's quite an interesting one. So all of that was here. Ships came from the four corners of the world. They came from England, from Germany, from France, from North and South America, from China, from Japan, from Russia, from the Philippines, from Australia, from Tahiti. Long list. And did you know that on Fanning Island, which by the way belonged to the US because they illegally annexed it, already in the 1820s there was a P.O. box. And so when a ship was in the vicinity, they would drop a message so that all the other ships would know about their whereabouts. This is how, for instance, Honolulu knew that eventually Captain A.P. Jones would appear here in 1826, months before, one already knew that. We think we're so modern, you know, with iPhones and so forth, but already then they were pretty well organized in that sense. So, Kalakaua, as you know, ascended the throne in 1874 after a contested election. Now, who elected the monarch if there was no successor proclaimed by the previous sovereign? Yeah, the legislature.
Yes.
So not only the representatives, but also the House of Nobles, the two together. Yes. And there were two candidates. Who was his opponent? Emma Lani, Queen Emma. And the Hawaiians, whom did they really want of these two? They wanted them. Why? Hawaiians are very smart.
They thought that Kalakaua was controlled by the Americans.
Yeah, he was too close to the Americans. Of course, Kalakaua also wanted to keep the country independent, but he thought that he could cooperate with the Americans, and Emalani, Queen Emma, thought it was safer to cooperate closely with Britain. Why? Why would that be safer for a small country in the middle of the Pacific Ocean in the 19th century?
They were a monarchy and they would
Yeah, they're a monarchy. They would support the monarchy. Americans are kind of. Where does this skepticism comes from with Americans of monarchies?
In 1850, Prince Alexander Nicklaus,
Yeah.
on his trip, to talk with Napoleon III.
Right.
They were returning back to Hawaii between Washington and I think it's New York.
Right.
And they had the train ride, like a train ride?
Oh, yes, they were thrown out of
Yeah, he was thrown out.
the
Almost
first
thrown out.
class compartment. Yeah, because of racism, they were considered too dark. Yeah, there were some other instances of that. So there was a skepticism on the part of Hawaii towards the US. But where does this anti-monarchic stance of the US really come from? The missionaries embody this, yes, very much. But it goes back to this whole thing with George III, right? And the revolution and the separation from the Brits. And it's interesting, of all the Anglo-Saxon countries today, the main ones, they're all monarchies with the exception of the US. Other Anglo-Saxon countries, which are monarchies? Canada, of course, also has French. Australia, New Zealand, they're all monarchies, right? The US is an exception in that sense. Anyway, so, but Kalakaua won, and then there was a riot, it had to be quelled, you know that story. They had to bring troops ashore from two American ships and a British ship. But afterwards, everyone fell in line and they followed Kalakaua nonetheless. And Kalakaua immediately got going. First, he wanted to ensure the business situation of Hawaii by engaging in a treaty with Washington, D.C. about what? The so-called Sugar Treaty, which really is a reciprocity treaty, which meant, often this is defined in a not very clear way. What did that treaty really mean? It meant
harbor for sugar.
yes. Well, originally it was not the lease of Pearl Harbor. That came later when it had to be renewed. But it meant that goods from Hawaii would be admitted into the U.S. free of a tariff, free of duty, and goods from the U.S. would be admitted into the kingdom also free of duty. By the way, I once was a little puzzled. I read an article by Josepa Navahi and his trip to Kapalakiko, San Francisco in 1874, and he explains the complicated sailing of a sailing ship, which it took. It took almost 3 weeks just to get there. And then there was a remark, Ikia Manava Helemai Nadute Maluna Okamoku. So somebody came on deck, Dute, and I said, what's Dute? Customs officials. Because in 1874 you still had to pass customs when you entered San Francisco. It's before this treaty, the reciprocity treaty. Today this is very common. We have reciprocity treaties all over the world, all over the place. European Union, you cross from one country to the other, there's nobody there who checks your papers. Now it's a little different because of terrorism and so forth, but essentially open borders. But at that time this was really a pioneering feat. And some people criticized him for that and said this is the first step towards annexation. But actually it isn't. It's just a way to improve trade. So that's the way we should see that. And then and that's because he was the Postmaster General for a while. He had many different positions before he became king. He was also an aide, to Kamehameha V. And by the way, Kamehameha V, we think now, really wanted him as his successor. but they couldn't nominate him because there was still Unalilo who had a higher rank than Kalako. But we think that secretly Kamehameha V wanted Kalakaua as king, and indeed, when we look at Kalakaua, he picked up on many of the projects and ideas of Kamehameha V. So in a way, it's a continuation of what Kamehameha V stood for. So, Postmaster General, so he knew something about mail service, and so Hawaii joined the second oldest international organization in the world. Which one? The World Postal Union, headquartered in our capital of Switzerland, Bern. Very nice building, very modern, huge building, quite an interesting place. And Hawaii joined on January 1st of 1882, 80 years after the World Postal Union had been founded. And strictly speaking, Hawaii still is a member of the World Postal Union. And today the World Postal Union is a subsidiary of the United Nations. So you can say that Hawaii really, at least indirectly, belongs to the United Nations through the World Postal Union. Now some people have a problem in accepting that. For some it's an inconvenient fact, but it's a fact nonetheless, I think. So, you see how progressive Kalakaua was. And then, a year before, really, because this is 1882, he did perhaps the most important thing of his reign, which was what? And I have this map here.
His world tour.
He went around the world. And he was not only the first king, as we always say, to go around the world, he was the first head of state. No president and no king had ever done that. And why did he do this? Why go around the world? It was a little dangerous. He had to leave Hawaii. Hawaii already had some problems. There was a group that would have liked to take over if they only could, namely our friends, some sons of missionaries and a couple of grandsons. That was very well known by everyone. But he decreed that his sister would act as regent. Why do we have these hotels? Regency, regent, etc. That's where it comes from, right? Like a key. So, with her in charge, he could safely leave the country for 9 months. Because in those days it took that long. Today you hop on the jet, but that was different in 1881. Why would he do that? Why would he travel around the world?
To establish international standing as a monarch.
Yes, to show the flag, and he took the flag along, took the royal standard along, and so we get into geopolitics, and that's really my main topic. And we have an interesting map here from Germany, 1859, and it shows the various powers in what we could call the Pacific and Asia theater. And when you look at this, you have the Brits. All of this is Britain with the crown jewel of the empire, namely India. Today it's India and Pakistan. And you have the Spaniards, they're still here. In the Philippines, 1859, right? And up here, Guam and the Northern Marianas. Who would this be here?
French.
The French in the Marquesas, but that's all they got at that time. Today they're all over here, French. Polynesia, and they're in New Caledonia. Oh yeah, they're already in New Caledonia here. French are also there. And then Wallis and Futuna near Samoa. And you have, of course, the Chinese Empire, then the Russian Empire. You have the US, but how far does the US go at that point? 1859. You know, until 1850, the border to the Wild West was the Ohio River. Never forget that. West of the Ohio, you had the Wild West. So that's 1850. Now this is 1859. Here you have the US, the Line Islands, including Fanning, which I just mentioned. And then here, what do you have here? It says Empire of Kamehameha. Hawaii. So you see how well established Hawaii was. Now, Kalakaua goes first to Kapalakiko, San Francisco, and he travels anonymously with a very small entourage. But his incognito is blown apart. They inform Japan that the king is going to appear, and when Kalakaua's ship entered the harbor of Yokohama, all the ships broke out the Hawaiian flag. And there was a huge celebration, and something unheard of happened. Namely, the emperor, Meiji Emperor, came and took him by the hand. Never happened before because you're not supposed to touch Japanese royalty. We had this problem here when the daughter, the only daughter of the present emperor, came, and the friends of Yolani Palace said that David Kawananakor should greet her, and two members of the friends, including myself, were supposed to escort him. So we escorted him to the front of the palace, and we waited, and then the motorcade came with the princes. And then David asked me, what shall we do? Shall we shake hands? And I said, no, you're not supposed, nobody's supposed to touch a member of the family. Let's see what she does. So she comes out of the limousine, goes straight to us like this. So that was clear. I never forget the Japanese consul general. His eyes shot all over the place. It was on needles, proverbial needles. Anyway, Japan, huge success. Two monarchs getting together. Kalakaua being the first foreign monarch ever to visit Japan. What did they talk about? We now have the records from the Japanese imperial household. We know exactly who said what. But what do you think they discussed? Geopolitics. The problem, not so much the Spanish. The Spanish were on the way out. Everybody knew that. They had already lost half of South America. The other half is Brazil. They had lost all of this in Mexico. Why? Why did they lose all of that? And when? Spain. After Napoleon, turned everything upside down. He occupied Spain. Spain was much weakened, and the colonies in this part of the world took this as an opportunity to break away from Spain. So the Spanish sun was setting, but the French sun was definitely rising, and so was the British sun. And so everyone was concerned with that. And what about the Americans? Another power to be watched. And so what did Kalakaua suggest to the Emperor of Japan? A confederation. Why don't we are independent, you have the same problems as we do, because what was the problem of Japan in 1881? What happened in 1853? Commodore Perry, with his so-called black ships, forced Japan to open up, because Japan had pursued a policy of isolation for 250 years. Why? Why did they isolate themselves from the rest of the world? Because they had the experience of Spanish Jesuits who wanted to convert them to Catholicism, and they kicked them out, and they said, we don't want to have anything to do with the rest of the world. The Dutch can trade a little bit through Nagasaki. Why the Dutch? Because the Dutch were Calvinists, the enemies of the Catholics, but on a very small scale. And as to the rest, we don't want to have anything to do with anybody. Could Hawaii have pursued such a policy, like Japan? Isolation. We kick everybody out. We don't want anyone here. You're all a problem. You're interlopers.
The Calvinists wouldn't have come.
Before they would have had to do this before even the Calvinists even came. No, Hawaii's too small for that. You know, you need a pretty sizable army and so forth to pursue a policy like that. Japan succeeded until Perry arrived. And Perry came because there was some problem with some shipwrecked whalers from American ships, and therefore Washington said, now we have to open Japan. Fast forward, what does it lead to eventually? 1941? Pearl Harbor. Yeah. That's the story of Pearl Harbor. Of course, it goes like this. Many other things happened in between. But if the Japanese had been left alone, there would have been no Pearl Harbor. Simple, right? So, these two monarchs discussed what to do because it was clear that the 19th century was the century of colonialism, and all these powers wanted to grab a piece of the cake. Wherever they could, whether it was Asia or Africa or the Pacific, they were all in that game, joined later by Italy, by Belgium, with a huge colony in Africa, the Belgian Congo. The Dutch. Do we still have colonies in this world today? Oh, that's a loaded question. I ask my students there. We don't quite know. What would you say? Colonialism, is it still here or is it finished? The UN pronounced in 1960 colonialism is finished. True?
Probably don't.
Well, the British still have some remnants. Where? When we look at this map, where is Britain to this day? In the Pacific, they have one island left in the Pacific.
Australia.
No.
Australia, they will tell you we're independent, but they still have the Queen. And there's a movement to get rid of the Queen. I don't think that will succeed in the next few years, but Australia is basically independent, but it still has the head of state, Queen Elizabeth II of Australia. So not Australia, but what? Small, very small, but still has the flag, but it has an anchor in the flag. That should give it away. Pitcairn! Where's that?
South Pacific.
Yeah, somewhere here. So Pitcairn is simply too small to be independent. 50 people. Norfolk Island, some of the descendants are on Norfolk Island, and some people say that's a colony of Australia, but I don't want to go into that. In the Caribbean, we have some British possessions. Like what?
Falklands?
Yeah, at the tip of South America, the Falklands, and the people there absolutely want to stay with Britain. More power to them. They're Scottish, most of them. They certainly don't want to join Argentina, because Argentina has some claims. In the Caribbean, we have the British Virgin Islands. We have several other islands which are still British. We have
Bermuda.
up here, Bermuda, right? Which has far-reaching autonomy. By the way, there's something new. There's a new development that's called para-diplomacy. So these entities which still belong to some metropolitan power see all these independent countries, some very small, and they say, we also want to engage in diplomacy. And so they send diplomats around, but because they're not completely independent, it has to be a kind of semi-diplomacy. By the way, do you know that even OHA sometimes plays this game? the executive director of OHA, for instance, was invited as an observer by a group of independent Pacific countries, and so that's also para diplomacy. It's a very interesting evolution. There's even an island in the Caribbean which is shared by the French and another European country. Let's see whether you're aware of that. Which other European country? They were hit by a hurricane, just like Puerto Rico, and the president of France visited his part of this island, and the king, European king, visited the other part. Which king? The king of the Netherlands. So there's a condominium between the Dutch and the French. So you see how complicated the world really is. But essentially, colonialism is almost finished, but not quite.
What's the island of the French and the...
Sint Maarten, as it's called in Dutch, and Saint Martin, as it's called in French. I did not know that until the hurricane hit and these two personages came visit. They said, "What? The French and the Dutch share an island in the Caribbean?" But yeah. Okay, so you see why these two monarchs were concerned. And Kalakaua was the one who suggested to the Meiji Emperor, let's have a confederation of independent nations. There were not too many left at that time. Who else was independent? So Japan was independent, Hawaii was independent. In Asia, who else? Siam, today known as Thailand, and Persia or Iran, and of course the Ottoman Empire, and Bhutan and Nepal in the Himalayas. And so that was the idea, to form a league of these independent countries as a bulwark against these colonialists. How did the Japanese emperor react to this suggestion of Kalakaua? Well, that's very interesting. He said, "Yes, that sounds great, but perhaps it's a little early. Perhaps we should wait a little." And then later, he picked up this idea. Actually, his successors picked up this idea. And now we get to World War II, and the idea has changed very much. And what does it result in? What was the goal of Japan in World War II? The greater Asian co-prosperity sphere. That comes from Kalakaua, but it was modified in a negative way, because it meant that Japan would control a huge area and tell these other countries what to do. Kalakaua did not have this idea at all. He just wanted an alliance of independent states against the colonial powers. So you see what happens to great ideas. Sometimes they go in the wrong direction. But it's Kalakaua who started that. Another thing, Kalakaua said, we have an unequal treaty with Japan. Japan was recognized in 1871 as a country, but its independence was limited by what? Consular jurisdiction. What does that mean? It meant that if an American ran afoul of the law in Tokyo, the Japanese could not adjudicate him. It was the US consul who adjudicated such a person. Hawaii had the same privilege. So if a Hawaiian subject, as we would have to say in a monarchy, you're a subject, not a citizen, but it amounts to the same thing, had committed some crime, it would have been the Hawaiian consul who would have had to adjudicate this person. And this is an infringement on the sovereignty of a proud nation. And Kalakaua, when he heard this, because he did not quite realize this, immediately said, we're going to lift this embarrassing restriction on Japan sovereignty. Problem was that one of the companions was not really loyal. William Armstrong, he was of the missionary group, and the first thing he did when he heard that Kalakaua wanted to lift this restriction was to run to the American ambassador and tell him about this, and so it was nixed. But now comes the most extraordinary point. Lili Uokalani picked up on that. And she said, well, my brother tried and failed, but now I do it. And Hawaii actually lifted this restriction on Japan, and it was the first country to do that. And you know when that happened? It happened one day after she had been overthrown. So January 18th, 1893. How is that possible? Queen is overthrown, and her ambassador in Japan notifies the Foreign Ministry of Japan, we lift this restriction on your full sovereignty. How is that possible? One day after the overthrow. Simple. There was no telephone line, there was no cable, no radio, so nobody knew in Japan what had transpired here. So for once, this worked in Hawaii's favor. And the Queen scored a huge success a day after she had been removed. And because Hawaii had started this, all the others had to follow. First Britain, and then everybody else. And so Japan became completely sovereign. It took several years. I think it took until 98 or so, 97 or 98, but it became fully sovereign. So again, an idea of Kalakaua. So geopolitics, this is all geopolitics, the combination of politics and geography. And in order to understand what's really cooking, we have to become ma'a, or accustomed to geopolitics. I have a question to you. Why did the US want Pearl Harbor? What for?
Strategic Navy port.
Yeah, strategy, but strategy in connection with what? Strategy itself is meaningless. You have to have a goal.
Well, they had been in the Honolulu Harbor, but it wasn't adequate for their needs.
Okay, but that still raises the question, why do they want to have their fleet here? You have to have a goal. Just having nice ships doesn't do you much good unless you have a purpose. What was the purpose in...
The Philippines during the Spanish?
No, the Philippines were kind of a backwater and nobody paid much regards to the Philippines until 98, the Spanish-American War. That changes it. But in 93, when the Queen was overthrown, and the Boston helped because of Pearl Harbor, essentially, the Philippines were not very interesting. Sugar? Well, they always talk about sugar, but half of the sugar planters were against annexation. Why? Half were for, half were against. Well, it would upset the whole, Master and Servants Act, and there was the exclusionary policy in the US against Asians, and so forth and so on. So many sugar planters were actually against it. It wasn't sugar. It was sugar for some, but for many it wasn't. No, it was a certain country that they wanted to dominate to a certain degree. Which one? No one? China. It's China. They couldn't take it over, it's too big, but they could dominate it economically. And after the Civil War, the US wanted to export agricultural products and machinery, and they hatched a plan in 1855. Are you familiar with that? in the back office of a local newspaper in Maine, Augusta, Maine, the Kennebec Journal, I think it was called. Several of the players that had something to do with so-called annexation did that, including our friend Stevens and Blaine, Secretary of State, and some others. And they said, in order to dominate China, what do we need? From the point of view of Washington.
Hawaii.
Yes, Hawaii. What else? Midway, which they eventually got legally because nobody lived there, so you could annex it legally. What else? If you look at this map, well, what about Guam? What about the Philippines? And what about, what's this?
Alaska.
Yeah. Did they manage? They got everything, but now we would say with the exception of Hawaii. Why can we say that? All the others, yes.
No treaty of annexation.
There's no treaty of annexation. Right. So, but Alaska is legal, Guam and the Marianas are legal. What happened to the Philippines? They got them too, the Treaty of Paris after the Spanish-American War. Well, the Philippines eventually became independent when? 1946. But until 46, they were American. Alaska, they bought from whom?
Russia.
Yeah, ask the Russians, why did you sell it? Because, you know, when you have a buyer, you have to have a seller, right? I could see why Seward wanted to buy it. But why would the Russians sell it? What do you think they told me in Moscow? They said, you know, we were overextended. We still don't know how big Siberia really is. And then we were even here. And the sea otters kind of began to diminish in numbers because the fur of the sea otters was a major point. And we figured that eventually the British would attack us from British North America, meaning Canada, or the US would attack us. So perhaps it's better to get some money from them and be rid of that problem, and that's why they sold it.
Nicklaus, when did Russia claim Alaska?
In the 18th century. Yeah. The problem is they really controlled only a small part of it, mainly Sitka and this area. The rest they didn't control. They just maintained that they controlled it. So there's a kind of a sovereignty movement in Alaska on that basis. But anyway, that was a master plan hatched in 1855 in this back office of the Kennebec Journal. And most of these plans lead to nothing, but this one certainly was quite successful much later. So that's also geopolitics. So the two sovereigns were very much aware of that. Also, Kalakaua proposed a marriage between whom? His niece, namely Kaiulani, and the nephew of the emperor. You know, I asked one of the consuls general of Japan about that, and he politely smiled and said, yes, we know. And I said, yes, but they were kind of against it, yeah. And I said, can I ask you why? Then he smiled again, very Japanese. And then he didn't say anything. Then I said, were you afraid to irritate Washington, D.C.? And he said, yes. And that was another point. The Japanese imperial family wants to keep the blood as pure, quotation marks, as possible. But it was a grand scheme. Even though, you know how old Kaiulani was when Kalakaua proposed his marriage? 4. And the prince was 15. But this was traditional in Europe. We have had this kind of thing all over the creation. That's why all these royal families in Europe are interrelated. Whether it's the Tsar's family, or the British royal family, or the Danish, the Greeks, they're all related. They're all cousins. World War I was a war among cousins. So sometimes families help, and sometimes they don't. And in the case of World War I, they didn't help very much. Anyway, so these deliberations were very interesting, and as I said, in recent years, the exact words which were used emerged from the imperial household of Japan, so we know exactly who said what. And it shows how progressive Kalakaua really was in his way of thinking. Then he continued. He went to see the Viceroy of China and debated things with him. And as a side remark, we have Sun Yat-sen, who was educated. Oh, in which country was Sun Yat-sen, the great reformer of China? Tell me, in which country Sun Yat-sen was educated?
Here.
In the Kingdom of Hawaii. Not in the US, not in France, not in Germany, not in Britain, in the Kingdom of Hawaii. And what he really wanted, it emerges, is for China a kind of government like the government of Kalakaua. Why? He wound up with the Republic, and then, you know, Mao Zedong and the Reds, and now we have Xi and so forth. But why did he think that the best form of government for China would be something like the Kingdom of Hawaii? What were the strong points of Kalakaua's government? On a native basis, but with institutions, some institutions taken from the West, so compromise, kind of a hybrid country with Western institutions, but on an Aboriginal level. And he thought that for China that would be the best. It founded because the Empress Dowager wanted to continue absolutism and not a constitutional form of government. And so Sun Yat-sen wound up with a republic instead of a constitutional monarchy. Otherwise, China might have gone the way of Japan, which works for Japan. It's a constitutional monarchy, right? And the emperor still, although politically he doesn't have anything to say, he still has a great influence, as we know. So China could have avoided a lot of problems if it had gone that way. Anyway, so Kalakaua continued. He went to India, which of course was under the British, and then through the Suez Canal to Egypt, which was still with the Ottoman Empire, and he talked to the Khedive. Khedive was the viceroy of the Ottomans in Egypt, but Egypt was coming under the sphere of influence from Britain. And then he went to all kinds of other countries. Italy, he met the King of Italy, he met the Pope, he met Victoria. He wanted to go to Russia. That would have been interesting. But Russia was barred because the Tsar had been assassinated by a nihilist, Alexander II. And there was national mourning. So as a sovereign, he could not go there. He also wanted to open a consulate in St. Petersburg. And I'm saddened by the news that the US consulate in St. Petersburg was closed. Not a very good development. So Kalakaua wanted the opposite, the Royal Hawaiian consulate in St. Petersburg. And, of course, Washington, D.C., and so this was a great triumph. And put Hawaii really on the map, and as a result, Hawaii, at the highest point, had more than 100 diplomatic posts around the world. Legations today, these would be embassies, and consulates general and consulates. So it was very well represented, including in Papeete, Tahiti, where the US to this day has no consulate. So they were everywhere. And when the Queen was overthrown, this was like, somebody said, was like having lost the head of the Pacific nations. So think of that. Well, there's much more I could tell you, but maybe you have all kinds of questions at this point. About geopolitics and Kalakaua and his wisdom and his far-reaching visions. And all, yes?
When he returned from this triumphal trip, when he returned to Hawaii from this triumphal trip and influential trip, what did he come home to?
Great reception. Everybody was very happy. Armstrong wrote the miserable book, making fun of him. But there was another book, probably written by Gibson, the famous foreign minister and cabinet member, which really showed all the positive achievements. And so we should read that one. And not you can read Armstrong too, but he has some deprecating remarks, like he said it was like traveling with a Polynesian lion in the golden cage and things like that. That's Armstrong. But of course he was of the, what later they called the Missionary Party, which advocated annexation and the Republic. In order to understand this, we should quickly look at the system of parties in the latter days of the monarchy. We had 3 parties. Do you know the names of these 3 parties in the 1880s, leading up to 1893? We have the Au Lahui, that's the grassroots. That's the Liberal Party, grassroots Hawaiians. What do they stand for? Bush and Wilcox and so forth. Willie Coffey. Strong monarchy and independence. Then you have the Au Lahui. That was a coalition of Haole and Hawaiians. And they stood for the same thing, strong monarchy and independence. And then the smallest, but the most powerful in a way, party was the Au Ho'oma'e. That's an interesting word. In English they call it the Reform Party. But Ho'oma'e is much more powerful than that. If you read the Bible, I always recommend the Bible to my students, because if you want to understand Western literature, you have to read the Bible. Ho'oma'e was the process used in the Old Testament when there was a suspicion of leprosy. So you had to go to the priest looked at your skin, and then you were dismissed, and after 8 days you had to return, and if it cleared up, you were pronounced clean, but you had to go through a ritual of cleansing yourself. That was called ho'oma'e. So that's a very strong word. It was also called the Missionary Party. Not the missionaries themselves. The missionaries had already mostly died, with the exception of Makualayana, who was the last one of the original missionaries to die. But some sons and grandsons who wanted annexation. So that was the situation. These 3 parties, and in order to understand Hawaiian history, we have to know about these 3 parties. After the overthrow, the 2 Hawaiian parties got together into the Homelula, Au Homelula, meaning Home Rule Party. And that's why Wilcox became the first delegate to Congress, running on the Homelula platform. But then there was a falling out between them and Prince Kuhio, and then something very strange happened, to me at least strange, because Kuhio took half of the Homelula people into which party? And the Republicans were a mutation of which party in the kingdom? The Ho'oma'e, the Reform Party. Reform Party mutates into the Republican Party. Why? Why Republican? Simple, because McKinley was a Republican. And so you had for decades a Republican Party which was really split into two halves. Annexationist missionary types and royalist Hawaiians in the same party, which I found very difficult to understand, but that's what happened. Do you see, it's complex, but I always say it's not so complex that we cannot understand it. Okay, that was an excellent question. Other questions? Geopolitics, yes.
Do you think it was just a period of time, or did it play a role that the Queen came into power? That these people felt that she could be overpowered? And secondly, what if Emma had won? What if Emma had won?
If Emma had won, we would not have this discussion today. Yes, because I think if Emma had been queen until the 1880s, when she died, Hawaii would have been saved because of a very close relationship to Great Britain. The first question, yes, it played a role. It played a role that Lili Orkolani was a lady. She had really 3 strokes against her as seen through the eyes of some of the missionary sons and grandsons. She was a queen, that was not so good. She was a woman, that was not so good either, and she was not white. So there's an element of racism. On the other hand, she was extremely strong, and she knew exactly what to do, and she was very skilled diplomatically. And she did things in such a way that the door is open today, because her statement when she stepped down provisionally and temporarily put the ball squarely into the bailiwick of DC, and DC hasn't solved it yet. So the fact that she did not fight, which she could have, because she had 500 men under arms. She had cannons, which Kalakaua bought in Vienna, 1881. That's another thing which he did. He bought the best cannons in the world. Krupp, famous munition factory of Germany. But in Vienna they were made in license by the Austrians with the same guns. So we don't know what would have happened if she had fought. They might have won the first round, but then what would have happened? The US would have sent 4 ships or 5, and then they would have lost. And then there would have been a conquest and a peace treaty, and the peace treaty would have contained a clause of annexation, and it would have been legal. So the fact that she did not do that left the door open to this day. She was really a great master. She also had good advisors. Her best advisor in that sense perhaps was Paul Neumann or Newman, Jew from Germany, who was her former Attorney General. He drew up the Declaration. The Declaration is absolutely masterful. Now they say she abdicated, but first of all that was under duress, and that was in 95. And secondly, wrong name. They had her sign with which name?
Dominus?
Yeah, Mrs. Dominus. That's not her name. Her name was Lili Orkolani. So that's not valid. By the way, I heard the same thing about the abdication of the Tsar. I was told by the Archbishop of Western America, San Francisco, Western America, that he signed it with a pencil, and that's illegal. So from that, well, it doesn't make any difference now, but from that point of view, he really never really abdicated. The Queen certainly didn't abdicate because the name was wrong, apart from the fact that it was under duress. Now, these are excellent questions. What else? Yeah.
I understand now why it's so important that Hawaii was recognized as a nation.
Oh, yes.
But I'm wondering back then, for example, China and Japan and Korea have these nations that have existed for over 2,000 years. Why is it that it's so important to them to be, who they want to be recognized ultimately as by Europeans?
Yes, it's
And
the
why-
modern system.
But why is that so, why do they, the Europeans are not right next to them, they're powerful and strong in their own way. I'm not understanding why it seems everybody capitulates or feels this need.
Well, it has something to do with colonialism, the fact that Europe and the Western countries had so much power, and all the rest of the world had to adjust to a certain degree. It really goes back to 1648. That's when the nation state, the modern nation state, appears. And 1648, does anyone know? There was a peace treaty. We had a 30 years war in Europe over religion between the Lutherans and the Catholics. 30 years. We lost half of the population in Central Europe. And the war finally ended with the Treaty of Westphalia. And the Treaty of Westphalia established a modern nation state. And all these countries today go back to 1648, including Rome. So the whole protocol, the etiquette of a modern state essentially was created in 1648. Then there was the Congress of Vienna after Napoleon, 1814, 1815. They refined some of these points, but all of that is still valid today.
Although this is Europe, and I guess, I don't know if this is the appropriate, place to try to understand Asia. I'm curious at how, because it all impacts ultimately Hawaii as well, why everybody needs to be recognized by these Europeans.
I think, first of all, most of all, it holds, that pact holds all the European countries accountable. So yes, China or Russia or Japan, everybody could have kind of thought on their own. But if you gain recognition, like with Hawaii, once Hawaii gains recognition, then every member country of that association is supposedly held accountable by the other mentioned. So if you can get the U.S. and France to recognize you, then you've got 110 nations who have sworn they won't mess with you. So it's a matter of kind of just getting that promise.
That's true, and everybody understood it. And when you look at Xi today, President Xi, how does he dress?
But in the end, it was pointless because in Hawaii they had that. But
Right, but you're right. Well, I wouldn't say it was pointless because you can still make that argument today. But yes, one of those nations broke the law and went against the pact. But at least it's something. I mean, if you didn't have that recognition, Hawaii would have been gone in the 1850s, 1860s.
Yeah, that's right. And the Chinese, he dresses like a Westerner, right? And so do the Japanese and essentially everybody else, with very few exceptions. Yeah.
Why is it that when the U.S. did break the pact, in a sense, why did the other nations actually take a stand for Hawaii?
Are you going to take on the United States in a war over what?
Yeah,
No.
or was there any other kind of pressure that many other nations could?
You know what? We still have this problem. Everybody is still afraid of DC right now.
Yeah.
You go to certain international organizations or foreign ministries and so forth, you tell them what the real situation of Hawaii is, they say, very interesting, yes, we have to study it, extremely interesting, and then they come with some statement which is totally false. Still, everybody's afraid because of the power. Not only military, but also economic. Yeah, we live in an interesting world, to say the least. And it doesn't mean that Hawaii cannot succeed, but it's an uphill struggle because of that. If you had to face a smaller nation, it would be easier. Somebody put it very succinctly. There was a meeting of several royals from the Pacific Islands, 2007. On the island of Raiatea, the famous Marae Tapu Tapu Atea, the temple of the navigators. And there was a lady from the southernmost of the Polynesian islands, Rapa'iti, Little Rapa, there's Rapa Nui, which is Easter Island, Rapa Iti. And she said, you know what? In Eastern Polynesia we are all royalists. But we face 3 entrenched republics. And that's our problem. Which republics did she mean? 3 entrenched republics in Eastern Polynesia. The US, who else? The French, and in the case of Rapa Nui, Chile. These 3. That was a very good statement. There's much truth in that. And the interesting thing is, these republics have high ideals. All of them. Liberty, the French ideals from the French Revolution, what are they? Liberté, égalité, fraternité. You go to Tahiti and they say, where are these ideals? Sounds very good, but you don't practice it. The only ones who really practiced these high-flying ideals were the Brits in the Pacific. I have this from the King of Tonga, he told me. I had an interesting audience with, not the present one, the father of the present one. He said, you know, all these powers are a problem, but the British were really gentlemen. And I said, what do you mean by that, Your Majesty? He said, well, when the time came to leave, they left. They sent a member of their royal family to preside over the festivities, and that's it. That's the British. Interesting. The French, huge problem. They have not left anything other than the New Hebrides, which they shared with Britain, and they had to leave because Britain left. 1980. Other than that, they're still where they have been for more than 100 years. That's the French, but liberté, fraternité, égalité. That's the problem with the West. You know, do you know that Ho Chi Minh was an admirer of Lincoln? So what happened? What about Sukarno in Indonesia? I don't even want to talk about the Khmer Rouge, the worst. They were all, you know where they studied, the Khmer Rouge? The Sorbonne in Paris. So what's the problem? The West has great ideals and does not follow them sometimes. That's the problem. And you see it right here. To me, you know, I'm convinced of Western values, but it really saddens me that we say one thing and we do the other. I think eventually it will change, but that's the real core of the problem. Yeah?
Nicklaus, I've always seen Kalakaua as you know, coming in after the election, he was a landowner.
Mm-hmm.
And he was, like you mentioned, he was allied with the Americans, not only Americans, but other businessmen.
Right.
He made quite a bit of money off those deals.
Oh, yeah, sure.
And for me, it seems that he had this Saul-like moment where he realized, wait a minute, these allies of mine might not be me anymore.
Right.
And then he turns into this nationalist and did it.
Yeah.
Do you see it as that specific a kind of moment or time when he just realizes what's going on?
Probably his trip around the world, I would imagine. And his meeting with the Emperor of Japan. But perhaps it was a process. Yeah, other questions? Yeah, sure.
Just related, and it's not Kalakaua related, but I think you might be able to know. The Gray 100, there's several sources that and they say it wasn't even 100 men, but there were several sources that talk about a German military outfit.
Oh, yes.
It was probably the backbone of the overthrow.
Well, there were only 30. There was, okay, you have the Honolulu Rifles. They had 4 companies of Honolulu Rifles. And there is the Willie Cocky thing. He marches on the palace to asked the king to do away with the bayonet constitution. The king is at the boathouse, which, by the way, you see very clearly on this presentation there, on this picture. And the cabinet, which is dominated by missionary sons and grandsons, including Lawrence Thurston, mobilizes the troops, and Wilcox and his men are outgunned. And he's arrested. And Belgium is tried and sentenced to be hanged, lumens. And then Wilcox is tried, and there's a Hawaiian jury, and they pronounce him not guilty. Then he becomes active. He becomes a member of the House of Representatives, and they manage, with a very small majority, to kick out the missionary, if you will, use that name, cabinet. And they put in the Royalist cabinet. And the Royalist cabinet, that's now 1890, Royalist cabinet demobilizes the Honolulu Rifles. One of the companies, dominated by Germans, say, well, we keep our guns, we might use them later. And they form a very Teutonic organization, namely a shooting club. We have shooting clubs all over the place. Shooting contests and whatnot, Switzerland, Austria, Germany, everywhere. So that sounds harmless, but they keep the guns for future reference. And so when Dole and his people march on to the old government house, Alii Olamihale, the first troops to guard them are men of the so-called 300, which means 300. But they're only 30. But they exist. And the others have no rifles. Of course, the Hawaiian forces do, but the conspirators don't. And actually, they run around trying to buy weapons. That's why Good shoots Te Aloha. You know that story, the police officer who tries to stop him? And that's the situation. So it's an inflated number, 300, now only 30 appear, but they did appear, and they guarded this group of conspirators that took it upon themselves to declare the monarchy abrogated.
Yeah, I always thought it was interesting that military group who was there.
Yeah, I was there.
Those guys just kind of fell away from history.
30 men, but you know, 30 men can make a difference if the others have no weapons. And the Queen hesitates to move against them because, why? Because right next door, who is right next door? On Mililani Street. American troops from the Boston. And they always say Marines, but the Marines were not there. You know where the Marines were? The Marines guarded the US legation, meaning the embassy, and the consulate. These were blue jackets. What's a blue jacket? Armed sailors. So we have to be careful. Not Marines, the Marines were elsewhere, but the ones that were right next to the government house and across from the palace were blue jackets. And the Boston in the harbor. And now there's a landfill, Aloha Tower and so forth. That was water, so the Boston was much closer and had a direct range of the palace, and that was the Queen's dilemma. Because the US ambassador, actually minister resident, one peg lower, prematurely recognized the de facto government. And you were the one who found a very interesting note, right? Can you tell us?
Yeah, and a little update, actually. So, I'm trying to think of the short version.
Okay.
W.O. Smith, William Owen Smith, was
Right.
the Attorney General of the Kingdom at the time, of the provisional government. And so he was handling all the legal documents coming in from the Queen and from everybody else. Smith kept all those documents and all the other government documents with the provisional government until January 28th, which is about a week and a half after the overthrow. Then they wanted to preserve them, keep them for safekeeping. And so they put them into the Charles Reed Bishop's bank vault, the Canadian Trust vault, to the trust and said, I want my grandma's stuff back. And they sent her everything. They sent her the personal stuff and the government documents. She had them until she passed, then her daughter had them. Maisie Sanford, you might know, she was a local woman involved in descendant and also a Smith descendant. She came into the Hawaiian Mission Houses Museum about 2 years ago and said, I've got this stuff up at my house, you might want to check it out. And we were all like, okay, yeah. Finally, Tom Woods, who's the president of this mission houses, went with her to her house. And at her house in Manoa, in her backyard, she had 57 boxes of government documents from the original government. Some of the most important documents in Hawaiian history, including the Queen's January 17th protest of the overthrow, the original. So it had been sitting in her backyard or in Haiku Maui for the last 100 years. But so that stuff was donated to the Hawaiian Mission Houses Museum, including a document from Minister Stevens, which is kind of a smoking gun to show that he lied at Congress. It says, and I'm paraphrasing from memory, it says, I recommend we do not make public my recognition of your government until we actually have control of the police station. So he's recognizing the government before they had real power.
And he addressed it to Judge Dole, who was a Justice of the Nation's Supreme Court.
So it's those arguments we're having nowadays about history and back and forth and so forth, the documents are there. And just a real quick update, so I gotta be careful about this. There's a difference between public and private archives. Private archives, like the Bishop Museum, like the one where I work at the Hawaiian Historical Society and others, they're private archives. They can show stuff or not. They can charge you to see it. They can, and with all due respect, Bishop does charge you, but they can be polite. The public archives are the public's archives, so the people's archives. And so there's nothing in the Hawaii State Archives that you cannot walk in there and see. Not a single document they own that you cannot see. You can take a picture of it for free because of the public state records. Adam Jansen, who's the current state archivist, is passionate about that. And so he moved to file a lawsuit about 8 months ago, reclaiming those government documents from the Hawaiian Mission Children's House, which is the missionary sons and daughters. They said they fought back, there was lawyers involved. The Attorney General is the one who makes that case. So the Attorney General was taking the case to court, and then just last week, the Hawaiian Mission Houses said, okay, we're going to give you the documents back. So that Dole letter, the Queen's letter, all those documents are coming to the Hawaii State Archives. So they'll be public documents once again. It's not a fun thing to do, and it causes ripples in the museums community and so forth. But his argument is that Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, those archives are open to you, and you can come in there and see them for free. And government documents should be available to the people. So that's one of the cases that they just settled.
Why did you think they were resisting?
No archive likes to give up its stuff. I'm sure president of the Hawaiian Historical Society. He said, Ron, you're next. So it's not a personal matter. It's a matter of where these records should be. To be honest, museums and repositories like Bishop Museum, they keep their status and they don't have a lot of money to support themselves. They stay alive by having people come in to see documents that they have. So no one likes to give up their collections. But then you can make the argument these are public documents that should be a public archive.
That's a very powerful note. And I cannot imagine why he put it on official stationery, because it says U.S. Legation Honolulu. Yeah. If I had written something like that, I would have used a very innocuous slip of paper, right?
Bar napkin.
Amazing. What else? Thank you. 95 boxes, you say? I thought it was one box.
I think. 57 boxes.
57 boxes.
It's an incredible collection. Yeah.
You see, things are coming out. We always suspected that, but we had not proved.
Right. And the Queen's document, to me, as a historian, I was fascinated that some of these documents, you don't ever wonder where it's original. You just assume it's somewhere. But the Queen's protest that she wrote, all of us have read it probably in Kaikendall, in Dawes, and all these places. But those guys never saw it. Yeah. They took it out of the newspaper because the original was in Auntie's backyard up in Nicklaus. So the one the Queen sat down and wrote, to be able to have students come in and see that,
anything else you would like to know? Lots of things to think about. Fascinating.
I have a question. You mentioned, I believe, that Kalakaua kept going with Kamehameha V's some of his ideas.
Right.
And I do remember you saying something about Liliuokalani continuing with Kalakaua's some of the ideas that he had.
Right.
Were there more, or is there any legacy that we see today other than archival, historical? Are there any that you might think of, concrete, visible things that we see but we don't recognize?
Yes, there's still the buildings, for instance, of the various consulates. And I think one of the buildings was identified in Italy and another one in Brussels. So the former consulates, in some cases, are still around. And there's, of course, this whole legacy of an independent country with the treaties. Treaties with 20 countries, friendship treaties between the Kingdom of Hawaii and Italy, Russia, United States, my own country, Switzerland. And these treaties are still valid, really, because they were never cancelled. So yeah, there's a lot still there. It's a little bit like Estonia, you know. Estonia was for 50 years Soviet, or occupied by the Soviets. And then they re-established their independence. And then they went to the French and said, you know what? We had an embassy in Paris, and you gave it to the Soviets. You better give it back to us. And the French actually did. I went there to have a look. And so Estonia is back in its old diplomatic building. So that's how these things sometimes happen. Yeah, the effects are still here. And then all the paperwork, as we just heard from Ron. Documents, we have it. Very powerful, particularly when you actually see it. So the question is what to do now. That's the big question. I always tell my students, you're the future movers and shakers, it's your baby.
Are we done?
I guess I had a DVD, but I guess it's we have spent. Oh, thank you. We've spent a lot of time because there's so much to tell about Kalakaua. Maybe we should have another session, because Austrian television did a very good program on the King's voyage around the world, and also the musical aspects of it, because they collected a lot of notes in Vienna. And so we have so many waltzes in Hawaiian music, like the Maile waltz and so forth. So there's the Hawaiian Renaissance, which goes back to Kalakaua in a way. The hula, which he revived publicly, all of that. Also very important, not only geopolitics, culture. It all works together. It's the so-called big picture. We have to look at the big picture. What really is what are the forces brought to bear? How does it all tie together instead of getting lost in details? There's a big picture, and that's why we have to smile. So if the Germans recognized the empire of the Kamehamehas in 1859, that means something. They used the word Reich, which means empire. So all these others are Western powers, but there's the empire of Hawaii in the middle of the Pacific. And what a triumph to be recognized by Britain and France, the two most potent colonizers in the 19th century. And I always wondered, why would those two cooperate? Because they were basically enemies most of the 19th century. It was a window of opportunity when they actually cooperated because of Argentina and how I used the window of opportunity. Very short when the window closed, but it existed. And that's when they got this recognition. Would not have worked in 1850 or 1830, but in 1843 it did work. So sometimes you have to have some luck too. Proper constellation. Then you move. Bismarck understood this. The Iron Chancellor of the German Empire, he understood this very well. So it really takes statesmen, and these, Kamehameha III was the statesman, and his three diplomats who went to Paris and London, and also Brussels and DC, understood this very well. And where this skill in diplomacy comes from with Hawaiians? It comes from the fact that monarchy here is 1,000 years old, not just Kamehameha. It just unified everybody. But there were these fluctuating kingdoms ever since about 1,000 or so. And when you have this situation, you need diplomacy so that you don't have constant warfare. That's where they honed their skills, 1,000 years. So we should be aware of that also.
That's a great point. I thought about that. The interkingdoms between, say, Hawaii Island and Maui.
Right.
They were constantly, I guess I imagine they were constantly having diplomatic relations.
Yes, absolutely. So everything is much older than one thinks.
Well,
Well, if they were constantly balancing, they hear. But those in between times, they had to,
yeah.
Thank you very much.
Sure.